At the moment, there is a very poisonous, destructive, and utterly counterproductive set of ideals being pushed upon the quote-unquote right.
Yes, how poisonous to support individual liberty. How poisonous it must be to support individualism. This is quite laughable to say the least, considering the fact that imperialism, colonialism, fascism, Nazism, communism are all collectivist systems, and under those very regimes we saw millions of people wiped off the face of this earth.
And this idea is that the salvation for Western man lies in the abstract idea of individualism. That somehow those who built Western civilization, those of European descent, will have the best chance of survival if they work toward being individuals.
So the reason why your argument is overly simplistic is because the fact that just because you support individualism, it does not mean to say that you support free flow of immigration. And Lew Rockwell, in fact, had pointed this out himself in favour of anarcho-capitalism. I might not be an anarchist myself, however, even then, in support of individualism, he spoke of a decentralised immigration control, simply because the fact that you have private ownership of land. You can't just have people just walking onto people's private property and saying and doing whatever they like. You have the protection of individuals' private property. It's a very overly simplistic view to say, oh look, here's individualism, therefore that must mean the support of the free flow of immigration. And this is more or less what you're insinuating. You're insinuating that in order to save mankind, we need this strong national government, and somehow we need strong collectivism in order to save us all. And that just isn't the case.
That the antidote to the West's problems is not those of European descent standing together and working as a group that identifies with one another based on race, culture and tradition, but for those of European descent to walk alone. What's more, the people pushing this poison claim that those like myself, who advocate for Europeans working together as a group and advocating that Europeans should pursue their own identity politics, are the bad guys.
You overly simplify the meaning of individualism. You think individualism just means individuals all for themselves and it's every man for himself. That just isn't the case. Individualism simply means the freedom of the individual to choose what they wish to do, whether they work in collective groups or whether they work by themselves. It's their own free choice to pursue their own economic goals and paths by themselves, and the primary element of the economy is the individual, and the state is nothing but a servant to the individual. And this is basically what individualism is all about. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to individualism, people were living in extreme poverty, and in fact something unprecedented happened that history had never seen before in mankind. Between 1780 to 1820, the British population saw real wage earnings rise by 0.55% on average per year, and then between 1820 to 1850 the real wage earnings had increased by 1.2% on average per year. Again, this was something unprecedented. The world had never seen it before. So in other words, the whole of society was getting richer, the living standards massively improved in that time period alone because of individualism, and yet here you are preaching about collectivism that had existed for century after century after century, for thousands of years since the start of the agrarian revolution, and yet throughout that entire time period people were living in misery. In fact, what you had was an aristocracy, or even if you want to talk about the Roman Empire, you had the emperors or the aristocracy living with most of the wealth and the masses living in poverty. It wasn't until individualism came along that you seen the life expectancy more than double. And of course we saw the population more than triple between 1760 to 1919. The 20th century, we saw your collectivism propped back up with the Soviet Union And lo and behold, millions die. All thanks to your collectivist regimes. About 100 million people estimated died of starvation, and let's not forget the millions who were massacred. Whether they were shot dead or, sent into gas chambers, it doesn't matter. The point being is your collectivism proved abysmal. How you could sit there and say such things about individualism is remarkable, considering the fact you have collectivist systems in imperialism, colonialism, fascism, communism, Nazism and all the rest of it that led to atrocity after atrocity. And we've seen the history prior to the Industrial Revolution to see what your collectivism was like.
Well, I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes destroying this nonsense. I wrote about the dead end of individualism and how this is pushed upon Western communities in order to destroy them in my book, The Fall of Western Man, which you can download for free from www.thefallofwesternman.com. In fact, there's a whole chapter titled The Rise of the Cult of Individualism that deals with how our enemies don't want us to be a cohesive body, how our enemies don't want us to identify with one another, but instead want us to seek individuality.
Individualism does not mean every man for himself or every individual for himself, and therefore they keep themselves to themselves. That's not what individualism is. Individualism is about the freedom of the individual being the primary element of the economy to choose what he or she does with their own individual life. Whether they choose to work in collective groups, that's their own individual choice. And if not, if they choose to work on their own, that is their own individual choice. It's not down to the state. The difference between individualism and collectivism is collectivism places the state as the main element of the economy, subordinates the individual's rights, and places the rights of the collective group above the individual's rights. And therefore, the state becomes the main element of the economy, and the purpose of the people is to serve the government. So what government says goes. And one size fits all. An example of collectivism would be the British NHS or anything of that sort.
They want us to be different from our brothers and sisters. They want the European people to be disconnected, to fail to identify with one another.
No, your ideals are cancerous because you think it is moral to use a state to force your will, what you want, upon individuals such as myself. There's nothing moral about that. There's nothing moral about thinking that your rights are somehow greater than my individual rights. Now, saying that I have individual rights does not make me selfish. It does not mean to say that I don't care about anybody else. That's far from the truth, and you would try to paint it that way. But this is the problem. You think that your rights as some sort of individual in this collective group is somehow greater than my individual rights. As a supporter of negative rights, I strongly stand by that each and every single individual has their own individual rights, and you cannot infringe upon another individual's rights, and it should be mutually accepted in that regard. In other words, we believe in equality in that regard, whereas you don't. You do not stand for equality. In fact, you think that your rights are somehow greater than my own. And that is where the problem lies, because you support violence, you support force, you support using the government against other individuals to force your will upon their will. Every single time we've seen this throughout history, all we have ever saw is self-serving governments. And every single time we saw this, we saw dictatorships. It really doesn't surprise me. In fact, I would not be surprised if you were the type of person to call Nazi Germany an economic success story. Economic success is measured by economic efficiency. There's nothing efficient about fascism. It's inefficient. It's faced with what we call the economic calculation problem. But I'm not surprised you wouldn't understand that.